In this video, we'll be discussing confounding variables for the within subject's design. So these confounding variables are these threats to internal validity that can occur. And so we're going to talk about two major sources of confounding variables. The first is going to be those environmental variables. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked about between subjects designs. Basically, the idea is that something in the environment might change from one treatment to another. Maybe you run some of your experiments during the daytime and others at night, and perhaps that has an effect on your dependent variable. Or last fall, we had this issue of some extremely rainy days. And so one of my classes, 2 of the days that they ran their experiments, because we were in person, was just this heavy downpour, and the other 2 days it wasn't. And so when they didn't, especially the ones that were setting in motion, when they didn't see an effect, they thought, well, maybe that rain had to do with it. And so that was something they discussed in their discussion, was how they didn't get significance, but perhaps that weather became a confounding variable. The other major source we're going to talk about are time-related variables, and there's a number of different time-related variables that we're going to discuss. Now, the idea here is that something other than the treatments occurs between the first measurement and the final measurement that influences the outcome of the experiment, or that dependent variable. So that there's something, whether it's a pre and post measurement, whether it's time 1, 2, and 3, that something between those 2 measurements influenced that dependent variable. So these are some of the time-related variables that we're going to talk about. We're going to split these time-related variables into 2 categories. We're going to split them into time-related variables and order effects. And we're going to start off talking about these time-related variables: maturation, regression towards the mean, history, and instrumentation. So in terms of maturation, again, we're talking about something happening between the first measurement and the second measurement, or the final measurement. Now let's say, this is kind of a silly hypothesis, but that Mrs. Pringle was going to give breakfast to her class for 6 months and then see how reading scores improved, because he believes it's because of the breakfast that the reading scores are going to improve. But during that 6 months, you have the first day of kindergarten, and then you have 6 months later. That's time that has passed. And by the way, this is my daughter Cammie. And so during that time, that 5 to 6 year old range, at some point reading just clicks with kids. And so was it really the breakfast that improved the reading scores, or was it just maturation or age? The next one we're going to discuss is the regression towards the mean. Now, a lot of people say that being on the cover of Sports Illustrated is a jinx, but really it's just an excellent example of regression to the mean. So the jinx states that whenever someone appears on the cover of Sports Illustrated, they're going to have, the subsequent years are going to be worse than that year, or they're not going to do as well in whatever sport that might be. But really it's regression towards the mean, because most players have really good games and they have really bad games. And a winning streak is really just that, it's luck. And so if that brings you that great luck, I mean, of course there's some skill behind it too, but if that luck brings you to being on the cover of Sports Illustrated, that might mean it's kind of an outlier. So eventually you're going to go back to your mean performance, and that kind of falls back again to that average performance. And so that's that, you're regressing, you're falling back to the typical mean. You ended up on Sports Illustrated because you were way above your normal average performance. Another one might be history. So history is something that maybe happened in the participant's life at home or school or work. And so I just put this thinking about reminding us of the visual illusion experiment that we talked about earlier in dim light and a dimly lit room and a brightly lit room, and seeing, was there a difference in being able to identify the visual illusions in that dimly lit and brightly lit room? Well, what if at time 1 the person does not have any eyeglasses, any visual accessories, but at time 2 they do? So now perhaps the dimly lit room was when they didn't have eyeglasses. They get eyeglasses at time 2 when they look at the brightly lit room. So now they can see the visual illusions better in the brightly lit room, or is it because of those eyeglasses? Something has happened in the participant's life at home, at school, or work that changes the behavior, that changes their ability to see that visual illusion, other than the treatment itself, the type of lighting. And then there's instrumentation. So perhaps the criteria for recording behavior changes over time because maybe a machine becomes less accurate, or the technology that's used is not the same. So for this one, I just had this example of listening to music. And so a lot of you are using music in your experiments. So what if your subjects were using 3 different ways of listening to music? Some of them have great headphones that are noise canceling. Others are just using earbuds. Or maybe they're, some of them are doing this like this, and then you're using these headphones at home or in the classroom even. But then for some, you decide, oh, I'm going to use this little speaker. Or maybe they're just using their computer speakers. So the sound might not be the same for all of them. The level of the decibels might not be the same, all sorts of different things, quality, decibels. So perhaps that instrumentation could be a threat to your internal validity. If everybody in your control group was using good headphones and everybody in your experimental group was using earbuds, that could make a difference in your dependent variable. So now we're going to talk about the next type of time-related variable, and that has to do with order effects. And so practice, fatigue, and carryover effects, those all fall in this category. And there are different ways of organizing and discussing these different types of time-related variables. This is the way your textbook does it, so I'm kind of, for the most part, so I'm following along with that, so it's easier for you to hopefully understand. But just keep in mind that other places you could kind of add some others in, group them perhaps a little differently. So again, these order effects, and again, they kind of have to do with time because they're happening because you're measuring one group of individuals over a time period, and they can produce changes in scores that are not caused by treatment, again, from one condition to another. So if you think about if you're doing a reaction time test and you have different conditions where you're measuring reaction time, they're going to get better over time. Or perhaps if you're measuring things in multiple conditions, multiple times, they might get tired of doing that measurement, or tired of answering the questions in your experiment. Or there's carryover effects. Maybe they do better at time 1 or at time 2 because of what happened in time 1. So the idea is that there's all these different things that order, and so we have ways we can control for this, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So in order to deal with these time-related threats or order effects, we can do a variety of different things. One thing is controlling time, where we control the length of time required to complete the study. Now what you do is you would look at the types of threats you think you might have to your experiment. Now if you think you have order effects, if you shorten the amount of time between treatments, that's going to increase the effect of those order effects. Things like practice, fatigue, carryover effects. So when you're looking, if you think you're going to have something like that in your experiment because maybe they're doing the same measurement over time or what have you, perhaps you want to spread that experiment out and control the length of time to make it longer in between sessions. However, those time-related threats that we talked about, maturation, history, regression to the mean, instrumentation, all of those we would want to shorten the amount of time, because the more time you have in between your different testing phases, you're more likely to have maturation or history effects. And so there, increasing the time between treatments increases the risk of time-related threats to variables. So to control for order effects, we want to increase the time, and to control for the time-related threats, we want to decrease the time. You could also switch to a between subjects design. So hopefully between subjects design videos and these, you're seeing that a lot of times the advantages of between subjects design are the disadvantages within subjects, and vice versa. So when you have two different groups, it keeps boring, tedious tasks from affecting the results. For example, it would prevent fatigue or boredom or practice effects, things of that nature. Another thing we can do is counterbalancing. So this has come up a couple times throughout the semester, and I told you eventually we'd talk about it in more detail. But counterbalancing is the idea that if you think you're going to have carryover effects or practice effects or fatigue, perhaps you want to change the order in which the treatment conditions are applied from one participant to another, so that you, again, we talked about looking at visual illusions in a dimly lit and a brightly lit room. Perhaps you want to make sure that some participants see the visual illusions in the dimly lit room first and then the brightly lit room, while others see those visual illusions in the brightly lit room first and then the dimly lit room, so that you're counterbalancing the order in which the treatment conditions are applied from one participant to another. So the goal is to use every possible order of treatments with an equal number of participants in each sequence. So the goal of counterbalancing is that it's going to prevent the time effects from having any systematic effect on a DV, on the dependent variable. It prevents the order effects from accumulating. So it's going to prevent the time effects from having a systematic effect on the dependent variable, but it doesn't prevent the order effects from occurring. It just prevents them from accumulating in any one treatment condition. So that's an important distinction to understand. It spreads the order effects evenly across the different conditions. So again, it does not eliminate the order effects. It has a better effect on those time-related variables, but not necessarily the order effects, but it does disperse those order effects evenly, so that means it shouldn't have an effect on that dependent variable. And for example, so again, let's say we had dimly lit room, brightly lit room. We'd also want another group that would go brightly lit room, dimly lit room. And sometimes students say, well, how do you, if you have one group, how are you randomly assigning them? You're randomly assigning them to these counterbalancing conditions. You don't necessarily, they're all doing the same thing, they're just doing it in a different order. So now we're going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of these of this within subjects design. So when you have a within subjects design, you need a smaller sample size because you don't have to split it into two groups. There's no individual differences between the groups because the same group of individuals is undergoing each treatment condition. So you don't have the variability within that group is the same for all of your conditions. The group in one treatment is the group in every other treatment. Again, because there are these repeated measures. So this is eliminating problems based on individual differences. It reduces variance and increases your chances of detecting a treatment effect. Every subject serves as his own control and appears in every treatment condition, so those individual differences aren't going to necessarily confound your study. However, we have disadvantages. We have these time-related factors which can influence the subject scores. So we talked about time-related and order effects, and so that can affect the outcome. There also might be participant attrition, where especially if you're measuring over the sequence of weeks or months, people might drop out. That's just a fact of life. When I was doing my Project Primer study that we've talked about, that was a big thing. We had to measure them. We went out to certain families 16 times throughout the year. Most of those families, they really liked getting that treatment, so they held in. The ones in the control group, however, where we were just going out and measuring their cognitive outcomes, when it came time for that final measurement, sometimes they were really hard to track down because they just weren't interested in participating anymore.